I still remember the way they laughed when I walked out of that lawyer's office carrying nothing but a rusted sewing machine under my arm. My cousins, Dylan, Trevor, and Vanessa, they got everything. The lake house in Wisconsin. The portfolio of stocks our grandmother had quietly built over 40 years. The antique furniture that collectors would pay thousands for. Even the damn silver cutlery set that had been in our family since before the Depression. And me, 43 years old, struggling to keep my landscaping business afloat, barely making rent on a one-bedroom apartment in a town I couldn't afford to leave. I got a Singer sewing machine from 1952 that looked like it had been dragged through 3 decades of basement flooding. If you've ever been a family disappointment, the one everyone whispers about at reunions, the one who never quite figured it out, you know exactly how I felt standing in that parking lot while my cousins loaded their inheritance into their BMWs and Audis. Before I go any further, let me just say, if this story hits you the way it hit me when I lived it, do me a favor. Drop a comment and tell me where you're watching from. I need to know I'm not alone in this. And hit that subscribe button, because what I'm about to tell you, what I found inside that machine, it's the kind of truth that changes everything. Check the description box below for more stories like this. Stories about people like us who got dealt a bad hand but refused to fold. My grandmother, Eleanor Pritchard, died on a Tuesday in March. Pneumonia, they said, but I think she died of loneliness. Her kids, my mother and my Aunt Patricia, they'd stopped visiting years ago, too busy with their own lives, their own problems. My mother had passed when I was 19, a car accident that shattered our family into pieces we never put back together. Aunt Patricia, Dylan and Trevor and Vanessa's mother, she'd been the golden child, the one who married a surgeon, lived in the white colonial with the wraparound porch, sent her kids to private schools. I was the son of the daughter who disappointed everyone. My father left when I was 6, just walked out one Saturday morning and never came back. My mother worked 3 jobs trying to keep us afloat, and when she died, I was left with nothing but a high school diploma and a chip on my shoulder the size of Montana. Grandma Eleanor, though, she was the only one who never made me feel like a failure. Every Sunday, I'd drive the 40 minutes to her little house on Sycamore Street, and we'd sit on her porch drinking sweet tea, talking about everything and nothing. She told me once, late in her life, that regret was the heaviest thing a person could carry. I didn't understand what she meant then. The reading of it will happen on a Friday afternoon in a law office that smelled like old paper and broken promises. Aunt Patricia sat in the front row with her 3 kids, all of them dressed like they were attending a business conference. Dylan, the oldest at 39, ran some tech start that I never fully understood, but that apparently made him wealthy enough to vacation in Bali twice a year. Trevor, 36, worked in finance and talked about market disruption like it was a religion. Vanessa, 33, was a real estate agent who flipped houses in gentrifying neighborhoods and posted about her hustle on Instagram. Then there was me, jeans with grass stains, a flannel shirt I'd owned for a decade, boots held together with duct tape and stubbornness. The lawyer, a thin man named Howard Breslin with wire-rimmed glasses and a voice like gravel, read through the will with mechanical efficiency. The lake house went to Dylan. The stock portfolio, worth somewhere north of $300,000, went to Trevor. The furniture, the jewelry, the art, all of it went to Vanessa. Every single item carefully cataloged, distributed, divided. And then Breslin looked at me. To my grandson, James Pritchard, he read, and I felt my stomach drop. I leave my Singer sewing machine, the one I've kept in my bedroom since 1952, with the hope that he will understand its true value. The room went silent for exactly 3 seconds. Then Dylan laughed. Not a polite chuckle, but a full-throated, head-thrown-back laugh that echoed off the wood-panel walls. Trevor smirked and shook his head. Vanessa didn't even try to hide her satisfaction. She actually smiled at me, this pitying, condescending smile that said everything she thought without her having to speak a word. Aunt Patricia just stared at the wall, her face unreadable. I wanted to scream. I wanted to flip the table and demand to know what I'd done to deserve this. What cosmic joke had been played that left me with nothing while they walked away with a fortune? But instead, I just sat there numb, feeling the weight of every failure, every mistake, every wrong turn I'd ever made pressing down on my chest until I couldn't breathe. After the meeting, I had to go to Grandma's house to collect my inheritance. Breslin handed me a key and an address I already knew by heart. My cousins were headed to the lake house to take inventory, already talking about selling it, splitting the profit. They didn't even acknowledge me as they left. I drove to Sycamore Street in a fog. The house looked smaller than I remembered, sadder, like it knew it had been abandoned. The key stuck in the lock. Always had. And when I pushed the door open, the smell hit me immediately. Lavender and dust and old memories. The sewing machine sat on her bedroom dresser, exactly where it had always been. It was covered in a thin layer of dust, the black paint chipped and faded, the metal parts spotted with rust. The wooden cabinet it sat in was scratched and water-stained. It looked like something you'd find at a garage sale for $20 and still walk away from. I picked it up, and it was heavier than I expected. Solid, like it carried weight beyond its physical form. As I walked out of that house for the last time, carrying that machine to my truck, I felt something break inside me. Not anger, not sadness, something worse. Resignation. The acceptance that this was my life, that I would always be the one left behind, the one who got the scraps while everyone else got the feast. I drove home in silence, the sewing machine sitting in the passenger seat like a mocking companion. Everyone thought I was the unlucky one. My cousins were already posting on social media about their inheritance, about family legacy, about how blessed they were. And I went home to my tiny apartment with a rusted sewing machine that looked worthless. But that night, as I opened it to clean the dust, I found something hidden within that made me cry, and it completely rewrote the story of my family's legacy. I didn't know it yet, but everything was about to change. Everything. I almost didn't open it that night. For 3 hours after I got home, that sewing machine just sat on my kitchen table, a monument to everything I'd lost. I drank 4 beers trying to work up the anger to throw it in the dumpster behind my building, to finally let go of the last thread connecting me to a family that had never really wanted me. But I couldn't do it. Something kept pulling me back to it, this nagging feeling in my gut that I couldn't explain. Around 11 o'clock, I decided I'd at least clean it up before getting rid of it. Maybe I could sell it for $50, enough to buy groceries for the week. I grabbed some old rags and a bottle of wood polish from under the sink and started wiping down the cabinet. The wood responded to polish, revealing a richer grain beneath the grime. Despite everything, it was beautiful in its way. Solid walnut, hand-dovetailed joints, the kind of craftsmanship you don't see anymore. I ran my fingers along the side, feeling the texture of the wood, when I noticed something odd. A small gap in the joint, barely visible, like the panel didn't quite sit flush. I grabbed a butter knife from the drawer and carefully worked it into the gap. The panel shifted. My heart started pounding for reasons I didn't understand. I worked the knife around the edges, gentle but persistent, until the entire side panel came loose in my hands. Behind it was a hollow space, maybe 6 inches deep, running the length of the cabinet. And inside that space were envelopes, dozens of them, maybe 100, all addressed in my grandmother's careful handwriting. I pulled them out with shaking hands, spreading them across my kitchen table. They were organized by year, bound with rubber bands that crumbled at my touch. The earliest were from 1953. The most recent was dated 3 weeks before she died. I opened the first one, from July 1953, and started reading. My dearest James, it began, and I had to stop, confusion washing over me. James was my name, but I wasn't born until 1982. I read on. You won't exist for another 30 years, but I'm writing to you anyway, because I know someday you'll need these words. Today I met your grandfather for the first time. His name is William, and he works at the factory where I just started as a secretary. It was a letter to me, written 3 decades before I was born. I spent the next 6 hours reading. Letter after letter after letter. My grandmother had written to me throughout her entire life. Through her marriage to my grandfather, William. Through the birth of my mother and Aunt Patricia. Through the death of my grandfather in Vietnam. Through my mother's troubled teenage years. Through my birth and my father's abandonment and my mother's death. She'd documented everything. But more than that, she'd written about things I never knew. secrets the family had kept buried for generations. In a letter from 1971, she wrote about how my grandfather's brother, Richard, had stolen money from the family business, money that should have gone to my grandfather's widow, to my grandmother, money that Richard had used to start the medical practice that made Aunt Patricia's husband wealthy, the wealth that had trickled down to my cousins. In a letter from 1985, she wrote about how Aunt Patricia had forged documents to put my grandmother's house in a trust that Patricia controlled, how she'd been slowly bleeding money from my grandmother's accounts for years, taking what she claimed were loans that were never repaid. In a letter from 1998, she wrote about my mother, about how the car accident wasn't entirely an accident. My mother had been driving home from a confrontation with Aunt Patricia, a confrontation about money and family and betrayal, and she'd been crying so hard she couldn't see the road. And in the most recent letters, the ones from the last year of her life, my grandmother wrote about the will, about how she knew exactly what she was doing, leaving me that sewing machine, about how she'd hidden something else inside it, something that would give me the power to reclaim what had been stolen from our family. The truth is in the bottom drawer, she wrote, hidden in plain sight, the way the most important things always are. I fell to my knees in front of that machine, pulling out the bottom drawer with such force it clattered to the floor. Inside was a false bottom, and beneath that was a manila folder, thick and heavy. Inside were documents, original copies of my great-grandfather's will, showing that the family business had been left equally to both sons, to my grandfather William and to his brother Richard. Richard's signature on documents transferring his share to William, and then later forged documents transferring everything back to Richard after William died. There were bank statements showing transfers from my grandmother's accounts to Aunt Patricia, marked as loans but never repaid. $50,000, $75,000, amounts that added up to over $200,000 over the course of 20 years. There were photographs. My grandfather and his brother at the factory, arms around each other. Before the war, before the betrayal. My mother as a little girl, laughing on Grandma's porch. Me at 5 years old, covered in dirt from helping Grandma in her garden, so happy I was almost glowing, and there was a letter, different from the others, sealed in a blue envelope with my name written across it in shaking handwriting. I opened it with trembling fingers. My dearest James, it read, if you're reading this, then I'm gone, and you found what I left for you. I know what the will said. I know how it looked. I know they laughed at you, called you the unlucky one, made you feel small. But baby, you were never unlucky. You were the only one I could trust with the truth. Your cousins, they're their mother's children, entitled, selfish, blind to anything beyond their own wants. But you're like your mother was before the world broke her. You're like your grandfather, who worked with his hands and knew the value of honest labor. You're like me, carrying the weight of other people's choices, and somehow still finding the strength to wake up every morning. The documents in this folder will prove that Patricia stole from me, that the inheritance she passed to her children was built on lies and theft. Take them to a lawyer named Sandra Kellerman in Madison. I've already spoken with her. She's expecting you. She'll help you get back what's rightfully yours. But James, hear me. Revenge is a seductive thing. It promises justice but delivers emptiness. Use this information not to destroy them, but to reclaim your dignity, to build the life you deserve, to honor your mother's memory and your grandfather's sacrifice. The machine itself is worth more than you know. It's a 1952 Singer featherweight, one of only a few hundred made in that specific configuration. In good condition, it's worth nearly $8,000. Fix it up. Sell it if you need to. Or keep it as a reminder that value isn't always obvious, that worth isn't measured by how much noise something makes or how shiny it looks. I love you, James. I always have. I'm sorry I couldn't give you more while I was alive. But I'm giving you this now, the truth and the power to decide what to do with it. Choose wisely, my dear boy. Choose with your heart, not your hurt. All my love, always, Grandma Eleanor. I sat on my kitchen floor and cried like I hadn't cried since my mother's funeral. Not because of the money, though God knows I needed it. Not even because of the validation that I hadn't been forgotten, that I mattered to someone. I cried because my grandmother had seen me, really seen me, and she'd trusted me with something precious. Not just documents and proof, but the burden of choice. The decision of what kind of man I would be. If you ever felt invisible, like your pain doesn't matter because it's quiet instead of loud, hit that like button. Share this with someone who needs to know that being underestimated isn't the same as being worthless. And check that description box, because trust me, this story is just getting started. I stayed up all night reading every letter, examining every document, piecing together the full picture of my family's history. By the time the sun rose, I knew exactly what I was going to do, and it wasn't what my grandmother had asked. I called Sandra Kellerman on Monday morning. Her office was in Madison, an hour and a half drive from my apartment, in one of those renovated historical buildings downtown, where the lawyers all looked like they stepped out of a catalog. But when she opened the door to let me in, Sandra wasn't what I expected. She was maybe 60, with gray hair she didn't bother to dye, and shrewd eyes that looked like they'd seen every lie a person could tell. "You must be James," she said, shaking my hand with a grip that meant business. "Eleanor talked about you constantly. Called you the good one. I'm glad you found what she left for you." I sat in her office for 3 hours. We went through every document, every letter, every piece of evidence my grandmother had collected. Sandra took notes in a leather journal, occasionally pausing to shake her head or mutter something under her breath about unbelievable and prosecutable. "This is solid," she finally said, leaning back in her chair. "The forgeries, the transfers, the loans that were never repaid. We can build a case for elder financial abuse, fraud, possibly even conspiracy. Your aunt could face criminal charges. At minimum, we can force her to pay back everything she took, plus interest and damages. We're talking potentially $500,000 or more. $500,000. The number hung in the air between us like a dare. Your grandmother wanted you to reclaim what was yours," Sandra continued. "She set aside funds to cover my fees for exactly this purpose. All you have to do is say yes, and I'll file the paperwork this week. We can have your aunt and cousins in court within 60 days. I should have said yes immediately. That would have been the smart thing, the righteous thing. Justice for my grandmother, compensation for everything that had been stolen from me, from my mother, from my grandfather. But I hesitated. What kind of timeline are we looking at? I asked, if we pursue this, court cases like this, 2 years minimum, maybe 3. It'll be messy. Your aunt will fight back. People like her always do. She'll hire expensive lawyers, drag your mother's name to the mud, try to paint Eleanor as senile or you as a manipulative opportunist. The family will fracture completely. But if we win, and I believe we will, you'll get everything owed to you. 2 to 3 years of fighting, of depositions and courtrooms and watching my cousins lie under oath, of every family secret dragged into the light, every wound reopened. I thought about what my grandmother wrote. Choose with your heart, not your hurt. Give me a week, I told Sandra. I need to think about this. She studied me for a long moment, then nodded. 1 week. But James, your grandmother was right about you. Whatever you decide, make sure it's what you can live with. I drove home in a daze, my mind spinning with possibilities. The smart play was obvious. Take them to court, get the money, rebuild my life. But something nagged at me, something my grandmother had written in one of her earlier letters. Revenge doesn't fill the holes in your heart, James. It just digs them deeper. That night, I did something unexpected. I called Dylan. He answered on the 4th ring, his voice wary. "James, is something wrong?" "I need to talk to all 3 of you," I said. "You, Trevor, and Vanessa. Tomorrow, if possible, at Grandma's house. The house is being prepared for sale. Tomorrow," I repeated. "It's important. It's about the inheritance." There was a pause. "Are you going to contest the will? Because if you are, just be there, Dylan. 2 o'clock. Trust me, you'll want to hear this." I hung up before he could respond. The next day, I arrived at Grandma's house at 1:30, giving myself time to set up. I brought copies of the key documents, Not everything, but enough. The forged transfer papers, the bank statements showing the unpaid loans, a few of my grandmother's letters. My cousins arrived together at exactly 2 o'clock, Aunt Patricia with them. They walked in like they owned the place, which, technically, they thought they did, and stopped short when they saw me sitting at the dining room table with papers spread out in front of me. What's this about? Vanessa asked, her arms crossed. I looked at Aunt Patricia. She was pale, her eyes darting to the documents on the table. I found something in the sewing machine, I said quietly. Something Grandma left for me. James, Aunt Patricia started, but I held up my hand. Let me finish. Please. I told them everything. About the letters, about the hidden documents, about the theft and the forgeries and the decades of lies. I watched their faces change as I spoke. Dylan's confusion giving way to shock, Trevor's skepticism morphing into anger, Vanessa's dismissiveness crumbling into something close to horror. Aunt Patricia just stared at the table. These documents prove that you stole over $200,000 from Grandma, I said, looking directly at my aunt. They prove the inheritance you passed to your kids was built on money that wasn't yours. I have a lawyer ready to file charges. Criminal charges, not just civil. You could go to prison. The silence in that room was deafening. But I'm not going to do that, I continued, and now everyone's head snapped toward me. I'm not going to drag this family through courts and lawyers and public humiliation. I'm not going to do what you did, tear people down to lift myself up. Then what do you want? Trevor asked, his voice barely a whisper. I want the truth, from all of you, about who you are and what you've built your lives on. And then I want you to make a choice. I slid a piece of paper across the table. I've done the math. $200,000, plus 30 years of compound interest at a conservative rate. It comes to roughly $450,000. That's what was stolen from my grandmother, from my mother, from me. I looked at each of them in turn. You three inherited around $800,000 combined from Grandma's estate. Here's what I'm proposing. You pool your resources and pay me half of that total inheritance, $400,000. We settle this privately, no lawyers, no courts, no public scandal. You pay me within 90 days. In return, I keep these documents private, and we all move on with our lives. That's extortion, Dylan said, but his voice had no conviction. No, I said, extortion is what your mother did to my grandmother for 30 years. This is restitution. This is me giving you a chance to do the right thing without destroying your lives in the process. Aunt Patricia finally spoke, her voice shaking. And if we refuse, then I file charges next Monday. And I take everyone you down with me. Your reputation, your careers, your mother's freedom. All of it gone. Your choice. I stood up, gathering the documents. You have until Friday to decide. Call me with your answer. I walked out of that house and didn't look back. The phone rang at 9 o'clock on Thursday night. It was Dylan. We'll pay, he said, his voice hollow. We'll have the money to you within 60 days. 90, I corrected. The agreement says 90. 60, he repeated. We want this done. I closed my eyes, feeling the weight of everything finally shifting. Okay, 60 days. I'll have Sandra draw up the settlement agreement. He hung up without saying goodbye. The check arrived 43 days later. $400,000, split between 3 cashier's checks from 3 different banks. Like they couldn't bear to coordinate even this final transaction. I deposited them and sat in my truck in the bank parking lot, staring at the receipt, feeling absolutely nothing. This wasn't how winning was supposed to feel. The money changed my life in all the practical ways you'd expect. I paid off my debts. Credit cards maxed out from years of barely surviving. The truck payment I was 3 months behind on, the back rent I owed my landlord. I put a down payment on a small house on the edge of town, nothing fancy but mine, with a garage where I could store my equipment, and a yard where I could finally plant the garden I'd been dreaming about. I expanded my landscaping business, bought new equipment, hired 2 employees. Within a year, we were booking jobs 6 months in advance. I was making money, real money. For the first time in my adult life, I wasn't living paycheck to paycheck. Wasn't lie awake at night calculating which bill I could skip this month. But none of it felt like winning. My cousins and I never spoke again. Aunt Patricia moved to Arizona 6 months after the settlement, and the family, what was left of it, fractured into pieces too broken to repair. I'd see Dylan's tech company featured in the local news sometimes, or Vanessa's face on a real estate billboard, and I'd feel this hollow ache in my chest that money couldn't fill. I kept the sewing machine. I took it to a restoration specialist in Milwaukee, a woman named Ruth, who worked out a studio that smelled like oil and history. She spent 3 months bringing it back to life, cleaning every component, replacing the rusted parts, refinishing the cabinet, restoring it to exactly what it had been in 1952 when my grandmother first received it as a wedding present from my grandfather. When Ruth called to tell me it was ready, she said something that stayed with me. "Whoever owned this took care of it for decades," she said. "Every sign of wear, every scratch. It all tells a story of something being used and valued. This wasn't kept in a closet. This was part of someone's life." I picked it up on a Saturday afternoon. Ruth had it displayed in her front window, and when I saw it, I barely recognized it, though it glowed rich and warm. The metal parts gleamed. The Singer logo stood out in gold against the glossy black paint. It was stunning. "It's worth about $12,000 in this condition," Ruth said, running her hand along the cabinet with obvious affection. "Collectors would pay more, but 12 is fair market value." I loaded it carefully into my truck and drove home. I set it up in the corner of my living room, near the window where the afternoon light hit just right, and I sat on my couch just looking at it. That machine had held my grandmother's secrets for 70 years. It had survived floods and moves and family drama and the slow erosion of time. It had been called worthless by people who measure value in dollar signs and square footage, who couldn't see past the rust of the story beneath, just like me. And that's when I finally understood what my grandmother had been trying to teach me all along. I called Sandra Kellerman the next Monday. "I need your help with something," I said. "Something different." 3 months later, I stood in front of a community center in the neighborhood where I grew up, watching volunteers carry in boxes of supplies. The sign above the door read, "The Eleanor Pritchard Skill Center." I'd used half of the settlement money, $200,000, to establish a nonprofit providing free vocational training to people who've been overlooked by traditional education systems. Welding, carpentry, small engine repair, basic business skills. Everything my grandmother had taught me about the value of work done with your hands, about how dignity came from creating something useful, about how worth wasn't determined by how much noise you made in the world. We launched with 30 students. Within 2 years, we'd trained over 300 people, and 80% of them had found stable employment. I hired Trevor as our financial manager after he reached out 6 months in, quietly asking if he could help. He never apologized for what his mother did, but he showed up every Tuesday to review budgets and file paperwork. And that was enough. Vanessa donated her real estate commission from selling the lake house to establish a scholarship fund in my mother's name. Dylan's tech company became our biggest corporate sponsor. We didn't become a family again. That ship had sailed, burned, and sunk. But we became something else. People connected by shared history and shared shame, trying our own broken ways to build something better than what we'd inherited. The sewing machine sits in the center's lobby now, in a glass case with plaque explaining its history. Students stop to look at it sometimes, reading the story of the woman who had truth inside something the world dismissed as worthless. I think about my grandmother constantly, about her letters, about the choice she gave me, about how revenge would have been so much easier than redemption. Taking my cousins to court, destroying Aunt Patricia, claiming every dollar I was owed, that would have felt good for maybe a week, maybe a month. But building something that mattered, something that honored the people who'd been forgotten the way I'd been forgotten, that was the kind of victory that lasted. Last week, a young woman named Sarah graduated from our welding program. She was 26, a single mother with 2 kids, who'd been working 3 part-time jobs and barely keeping her head above water. After our 12-week course, she got hired at a manufacturing plant, making $17 an hour with benefits. Not a fortune, but enough to breathe, enough to dream. She hugged me at graduation. tears streaming down her face, and she said, "Thank you for seeing me when everyone else looked right through me." And I understood, finally, what my grandmother had meant about regret being the heaviest thing a person could carry. If I'd chosen revenge, if I'd spent years in courtrooms destroying my family, if I'd taken every dollar and kept it all for myself, I'd be richer, surer. But I'd also be exactly what my cousins thought I was. Someone bitter, broken, defined entirely by what had been done to me rather than what I chose to do next. Instead, I got to become the person my grandmother always believed I could be. Some nights, I sit in my house, bought with my money, filled with furniture I chose, and I read her letters again, all of them, start to finish. Her words connected me to a past I never fully understood and a future she couldn't see, but somehow prepared me for. The truth is, she wrote in one of the last letters, dated 2 weeks before she died, "We all get broken by this world. The only choice we have is whether we let that breaking define us or refine us, whether we use our pain to justify hurting others or to understand them better. You've been hurt so much, my James, by your father, by this family, by life itself. But you have a choice now. You can take what's been done to you and pass that poison on, or you can transform it into something else entirely. Something healing, something true. I can't tell you which path to choose, but I can tell you that I believe in you. I always have. I believe in me too now, Grandma." Finally, if this story meant something to you, if it reminded you that being underestimated isn't the end of your story, but sometimes the beginning of your truth, leave a comment. Tell me what you're building from the broken pieces of your life. Share this with someone who needs to know that revenge isn't the only form of victory, that sometimes the sweetest triumph is becoming the person who hurt you could never imagine you'd be. And check the description box below. More stories like this, about people who found value in the things the world dismissed, about second chances and hard choices and the complicated, beautiful mess of figuring out who you are when no one's watching. The sewing machine my grandmother left me was never about the machine at all. It was about understanding that true worth of objects, of people, of lives is never measured by the surface. Sometimes the most valuable things are hidden in plain sight, waiting for someone brave enough to look deeper. Sometimes the inheritance that matters most isn't money or property or things you can hold in your hands. Sometimes it's a choice to be better than your circumstances, kinder than your pain, more generous than your hurt. That's what my grandmother gave me. That's what I'm passing on.